Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and today I'm very excited to introduce our guest, David Amber, who hosts Hockey Night in Canada for Sportsnet. Thanks so much for coming on, David. How's it going?
Alex, great to be here. Thanks for having me on. And so far, so good. We're just getting the season up and running, but so far it's been a lot of fun.
Great. So I just wanted to start off, and how I normally do with our guests is talk a little bit about their careers and how they became sports journalists. And in your case, I know your dad was in not a sports journalist, but your dad Arnold was in the industry, and I know he took you to Coach's Corner as a kid at Maple Leaf Gardens. Was it a dream of yours to be on Coach's Corner someday when you were a kid?
Well, it was really cool to meet Ron and Don. Very, when I think must have been a teenager back then, and yeah, my late father Arnold, he was an executive producer of news specials at CBC, so he covered a little bit of sports, but mostly it was the royal wedding and the Pope visit and all the election shows where sort of he was a great political mind. And he did do some sports, though, some Olympics, etc. And because of his position, I was able to sort of get a chance to meet Ron and Don, which was very cool for me as a young man who wanted to get in potentially into broadcasting and just loved hockey so much. So yeah, I guess a dream come true. I maybe the dream part of it was I was a huge Leaf fan as a kid growing up, and once in a while my dad would get tickets. They were horrible tickets. We'd always be in like the top row, and everyone would be smoking. It was in the 1970s. People would be smoking in the arena at Maple Leaf Gardens. But I just remember sitting there and watching, and just the sight lines at Maple Leaf Gardens, even though it was a long time ago, even if you were in the top row, were quite good. So I just remember that was always fun. 2, 3 times a year we'd go to a game, and just a chance to sort of be able to watch the players I love most, the Daryl Sittlers and the Lanny McDonalds of the world, was really cool as a young kid.
No, that's really cool. And when did you kind of start thinking about a career in sports journalism?
I guess I thought about it maybe a little bit in high school, but I don't think I was mature enough to really, decide like how the path would work. So I went off to university, and I'd say around my third year at undergrad at McGill University, I started to say, yeah, you know what, sports broadcasting would be something I'd really like to, I'm passionate about. I'd love to pursue a career in that. And so I just started out writing for the McGill Tribune, and I'd go and I'd cover sports events, and it was fun. It was just getting your feet wet a little bit, and then I sort of went full throttle after graduating from McGill to, how am I going to go about trying to make a career out of this? So that's when it really sort of hit me. I better get on that path.
And what was your first job in the industry, and how did that come about?
Oh man, it took a while, Alex. I'll be honest with you. I wasn't sure this industry was for me because I went off to university, back to university. I went to Syracuse University and did a master's in broadcast journalism. And I thought, oh wow, Mike Tirico went here, and Bob Costas, and Len Berman, and all these, Ted Koppel, all these incredibly, famous and successful journalists. Like, how hard could it be? I've got my piece of paper here. I found out how hard it could be because I started, shooting out tapes to all these different entry level positions as a sports broadcaster. Weekend sports anchor in Joplin, Missouri, and Jackson, Mississippi, and Bangor, Maine, and Redding, California. All these very little entry level markets, and it was just rejection. It was not fun. And it took me, long story short, it took me about 11 months of rejections. I left the States, I went back home, lived in my parents' house, and thankfully they didn't charge me rent. So I was able to just drive around and start handing out tapes to all these different news directors in Ontario. And finally, I went and met with someone in Sudbury, Mark Oldfield, who said, well, we don't have anything here for you, but I'll pass your tape along to the other MCTV, Mid Canada Television Networks, our stations, and we'll see what happens. And about 2 months after that, I got a call from Sault Ste. Marie. And so this is November, and I had graduated in December. So we're talking a full calendar year of rejection. It's a long time. But I was fortunate enough to get an opportunity to go out to Sault Ste. Marie, and I drove up to the Sioux, did an audition, and I got the job, and that was that. So that was my first career job, and like on television in front of the camera,
And,
and it was using a resume tape of stuff I'd done in school, and also just being able to sort of go and intern at TSN and go out with the likes of Rod Smith
yep.
and sort of shadow Rod, and that helped immeasurably. Learning from a pro like Rod and able to sort of refine my on-camera presentation, and everything at least got me in the door at Sault Ste. Marie.
And were you covering hockey? Were you covering football? What were you covering at the
I
time?
was covering news and weather and every now and again sports. Yeah, they said, look, we don't have a sports opening. We have someone who's in, we have our sports anchor. And when the sports anchor's sick, you can maybe jump into that chair. And I said, okay. And I did get some opportunities. The Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds kind of, it bled between sports and news because they were such a big attraction in the city that you'd get to, cover the Greyhounds, even if it was sort of a news item. And I was so lucky. Joe Thornton, who's going to
Wow.
be a Hall of Famer, was there on that Greyhounds team. They were a very good team. And one of the things that really helped me actually get my next job was I did a 5-part feature on the Greyhounds about the 25th anniversary of the team. And I kind of walked through the history of the team and how important it was, such an important fabric to Sault Ste. Marie. And then I put that onto a resume tape and I kept bugging TSN and shooting out tapes to TSN. And then one day I got a call after about 9 months in Sault Ste. Marie. I got a call from Keith Pelly, who was the most senior person at TSN at the time in terms of sports broadcasting. And said, hey, how would you like to go out to Calgary to be our reporter based in Calgary? And I actually was like, all right, who is this? I thought someone was playing a trick on me. It was like Sunday morning at 8 in the morning or something. I was like, it's Keith Pelly. I'm like, are you sure? He's like, yes, I'm sure. So I was like, absolutely. So then that was late 1997, September of 1997. And from that point forward, I have been doing network sports broadcasting, which has been fantastic.
And I know you went to ESPN and then later on to Sportsnet. I guess maybe describe what it was like working in the States for ESPN before going to Sportsnet.
Well, it was great. I spent 5 years at TSN, and I was a host. I was sort of an anchor on the Sports Center show
Oh,
for a
cool.
couple of years, but on the weekends, and I would be sort of a field reporter for some different events, as World Series and Stanley Cup final and NBA final, et cetera. And while I was out doing those events, I'd often would be, in the States, and there'd be the ESPN truck and they had this, hundreds of people. And it was like this big, big production. And then there'd be like me and a cameraman and a producer for TSN. It was like such a smaller production. I was like, oh my God, like look at all the resources there. And I crossed paths enough with them. I was like, well, it'd be really cool to get an opportunity to work on a scale like that. And I was very fortunate in about 5 years after I was at TSN, I got a job offer at ESPN, and I was down in the States, and I was hosting shows there, and I was at ESPN for 8 years. It was fantastic. It was worked with a lot of really talented people, and it was really interesting. Not as much hockey coverage, obviously, as we have here in Canada,
Mhm.
but trust me, we were the college basketball, the college football, which I loved
Yeah.
naturally. So it wasn't a bad fit for me at all.
And what were some of your most memorable, what would be your most memorable moment covering sports, I guess, for ESPN?
Well, I spent 4 years in studio as a host on ESPN News and some Sports Center and Outside the Lines, and then I did
Oh,
4 years reporting based out of Toronto, but traveling a lot, too much actually. Um, Gosh, covered a lot of really interesting events when I was out there. I did a whole bunch of baseball playoffs, NBA finals, so the Celtics and the Lakers NBA
oh,
final, which was
wow.
really exciting. Yeah, Miami Heat versus Dallas Mavericks NBA final. So there were some moments like that. Some NASCAR races were not my favorite. I'll be honest with you. It was a
Yeah.
different environment for me.
Yeah.
But it was just good to be exposed to that as well and sort of see what that whole situation's like. And I was really, one thing I was lucky with, Alex, is I had a chance to go down to Australia when I was with ESPN to do a story on a young girl. Oh my gosh, I'm having a brain blank. This is what happens when you get older. Who solo circumnavigated the globe,
Yes.
sailing. Oh my gosh, how am I forgetting her
I
name?
remember this story. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, she was 15 years old. We did a whole story that was really interesting. Went down, met her family, and we thought, oh my God, how you be sending your 50-year-old daughter out to sea like this? And then I met the girl, and I was like, oh, she's like an old soul. She's so interesting and smart, and she was able to successfully do it. And as someone who then ended up having kids of my own, I was like, well, it's, and the parents kept saying, we box in kids, we put them in these
Mhm.
boxes and say, well, you're so young, you can't do this, you can't do that, you're not capable. And their attitude was, of course you're capable. We just have to give them the opportunity.
Mhm.
And it's something I always thought of in the back of my mind. Jessica Watson was her name.
Okay, there you go.
Um, in the back of my mind, I always thought when I was raising my kids, yeah, you do want to kind of push them and allow them a bit more freedom. I didn't want my kids to solo circumnavigate sailing, the world, but it was a good parental, thought for me moving forward as I had kids of my own.
And just to move on to now you're working at Sportsnet, what's that been like and hosting games for Hockey Night in Canada?
It's been great. You know what? I was at Hockey Night in Canada when it was with CBC for 3 years, and then the rights came over to Rogers, and I was lucky enough to get a job to continue doing that. And I've been a rinkside host, and I've been a studio host, and it's been fantastic. We work with a great group of people, really talented, and they know so much about the game. And
Mm-hmm.
just to work with an iconic brand like Hockey Night in Canada, it's 70 years in running, and the longest running cable sport or sports program period there's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes it special is the passion, right? People are so passionate about the sport, and it's so much part of the fabric of so many different communities across Canada, and people care. And I take that as a serious responsibility. People really care about these teams. They're emotionally bound to it, and they're welcoming us into their living rooms. Alex, and sort of saying, we want an escape from our everyday life and all the work and all the stresses, and this is supposed to be a fun, entertaining, exciting 2.5 3 hours for us. So we take that really seriously. It's a real blessing we get that opportunity, and it's a responsibility we care about a lot. And it's been a fun and fantastic run. Although I'll say this, we're waiting for a Canadian team to win the Stanley Cup,
Yeah.
because it was really fun being in Colorado and Tampa and seeing Avalanche win the cup in Tampa, and all the different cups we've been to over the last decade or so. But since I've got into sports broadcasting, the Canadian team has not won the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
I was there in you know 2000 when I think New Jersey won, 2001 when Ray Bourque got his cup. I've been there through all 2002 when Detroit won another cup, but I've never been there in all that time since the beginning of this century to now, and it's been 30 years. So I'd love to know what it's like, whether it's Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, wherever, the cup's brought out and a Canadian team has the cup and the crowd's going absolutely, ballistic. So I'm hopeful that that'll happen sometime soon.
No, I'll ask. I want to ask you a bit later on about who you think is probably the best or some of the better teams in Canada this year. But I also wanted to just go back a little bit to Hockey Night in Canada. What do you think are some of the things that really make the show work, like in studio?
That's a great question. I think, first of all, having strong opinion and strong voices, and Hockey Night has that. I mean, there's so many good broadcasters across the country, but when you take someone like Kelly Rudy, who's been in the game for so long and has such a great respect for him from the hockey community, and Cassie Campbell Pascal, and Jennifer Botterill and Kevin BX, and you take these strong voices, right, who've made it to the top of their profession and are so they can analyze the game. They're so articulate, and they watch the game through a very sophisticated lens. I think about being lucky, to sit beside, the Anthony Stewarts and sit beside some of these guys, and they're watching the game and they have such a sophisticated view of what's happening. And to us civilians, it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And now I probably watch the game through a much more sophisticated lens now than I did, 10, 15 years ago. So I just think they're able to lend their voice with their backgrounds. And at the same time, I think we understand just how important it is. Like, we don't want to treat it like, oh my God, it's life or death, but you also don't want to, you don't take the viewer for granted. I think you have to recognize how sophisticated the average Canadian viewer is, and they want analysis, they want to be entertained, and to find that happy medium of, we're giving you information, we're analyzing the game, but we're doing it in a fun, inviting way where it's welcoming, and we're not yelling at you, and we're not, talking to you, but we're talking with you. So I think there's always a delicate balance there, but I think we have a group of people who really understand that. Ron, one of the most respected sports broadcasters ever, and Elliot Friedman, who's one of the hardest working and most credible guys there is. So when you have this whole team of people working together, it really works out well.
No, it's I as a viewer, I love the show and I love when you're on because I've seen you for a
Mm-hmm.
decade plus. I wanted to move on a little bit to diversity in hockey, and it's been it's come up more recently, probably for the better. And I know that you said that there's the Hockey Diversity Alliance. It started with the Kim Aliu and other NHL players and people, and I know that you said that hosting Hockey Night in Canada is an opportunity, but also a responsibility as someone of color, and that people come up to you and kind of say it's so nice to see someone like you in that role on the platform, such as Hockey Night in Canada. What does what does hosting Hockey Night in Canada mean to you as someone of color?
Well, I think you encapsulated a lot of it right there, Alex. It's so true, and it happens a lot. I walk my dog a lot. It's probably more than I need to, but it's good to get out and get some fresh air. So people come up to me, and quite often people who look like me and say, "Hey, it's really great to have you there," and sort of feel represented. And there's been a lot of underrepresented groups and a lot of marginalized groups, and there still continues to be problems. That there's a long way to go, but I do think it's important that our broadcast reflects society and reflects the community watching the games. And, I live in Toronto, an incredibly diverse city, very multicultural. And, hockey fans, you can put 10 people who look completely different in a row together. The one thing that might unite those 10 people is their love of hockey, their passion for the game, and the fact that they might be able to see someone on television or hear a voice and they go, okay, there's someone from my community or someone with my similar background. It's important. And it's just about having this big sort of mesh of different people with different life experiences. That's important to have. And I'm lucky to have that opportunity. And I remember as a young boy when you talked about wanting to get into sports broadcasting, I'm always a huge sports fan, always watch the sports highlight shows. When I was watching, it was before TSN, it was before Sportsnet, but we would watch, there was on CNN, there was this sports show with Vince Cellini and Vanner Earl Wright and Fred Hickman. It was, probably before your time, but this is what I grew up watching when I was, 12, 13, 14, 15. And there was Fred Hickman, who was, an African-American person. And I was like, okay, well, this, it's nice to see someone who looks like that on the set. And I'd be watching in Toronto, and I would see John Saunders and Mark Jones, and
Mm-hmm.
to have sort of people that you look up to and sort of say, hey, it is a possible position for me, and it's a platform with it's a very amplified platform. So to be able to be in that position is something that's really an amazing opportunity, and as you said, a bit of a responsibility too that I love having.
Do you feel there's almost a sense of ownership in terms of feeling like that you're a role model for kids growing up right now who are of color?
Well, listen, if any kids watching that sees themselves in me and says, "Wow, that's something I'd like to do," and they feel it's a more achievable goal because they see someone who looks like them has been able to accomplish that, then that's fantastic. Harner Ryan Singh is one of our play-by-play people. I mean, the incredible amount of hurdles he had to climb in his situation specifically to get to the role of a play-by-play person on Hockey Night in Canada. It's unbelievable. And there's a whole community, you know, behind him listening and saying, wow, this is amazing. And, again, I think what's been really nice in the last few years is there has been an acknowledgement. This isn't a hockey thing. This is just a societal thing that, there's been some barriers and there's been some glass ceilings. And, we need to, start from the top down, not from the bottom up necessarily. And, where we'll really get some great traction in games like hockey isn't necessarily when there's more black players or more black broadcasters, but once you have some black owners and then that and some black GMs, and then it'll just naturally cascade down. The culture will be more open, more inclusive. We talk about diversity, but it's got to be more inclusion and like wanted inclusion, and where it's a safe environment where people feel their voices can be heard and they can be themselves and they can act how they feel like acting, and not have to sort of find themselves into a box and be confined in that sense. And I think that's where we're trying to get to as a society. And it's slow, but at least now I think there's an acknowledgement, hey, there have been some barriers. We need to branch out and allow people to spread their wings.
I think I want to go off that to another kind of serious topic in the game of hockey, and that's the Hockey Canada situation and Kyle Beach and these kinds of stories. I think, what do you think has to change with Hockey Canada specifically and hockey culture?
Well, that's such a tough question, Alex. I think once again, there's finally a bit of an acknowledgement. This isn't, these aren't one off situations. There's been multiple accusations and multiple stories, and we now see multiple investigations taking place. And I'm sure we don't know about many, many other things that have probably transpired throughout the years. And, I think it starts with kids, right? We have to, what are we teaching our kids? And kids who are getting into hockey, what kind of role models do they have, and what are they being taught, and within the confines of the sport, what's being understood as accepted behavior and what's being considered not acceptable behavior, and do we need to have a really honest conversation about that? And I would say, yeah, I mean, as a parent of two kids, you always have these opportunities to say, well, this is a learning situation here, or this is an opportunity for us to really dig in on something because I'm not sure what you're thinking, what's right or what's wrong. And we need to have better overall judgment, and more empathy. And I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes these things get lost. My son played in the GTHL, which is the biggest
Yeah.
minor hockey association in the world, and there were some great moments for him, but there were some tough moments too, and things that he shouldn't have had to have gone through, but he did. And you have to wonder why did these things happen?
Mm-hmm.
Um, they don't necessarily happen when he's playing basketball
Yeah.
or when he's played soccer. So why is this happening in hockey? You have to, you don't blame the sport, but you wonder if there's just been an allowance of certain types of completely inappropriate and unacceptable behavior, and it gets, becomes part of, as you say, the culture of the game. So I think the awareness, the education, and what I'm thankful for is I work with a colleague, Anthony Stewart, who started
Yeah.
up Hockey Equality. He's doing a great job. He and his wife Shante, they're talking to kids. It's I don't say it's too late when they're 16, 17, 18, but so much of this behavior has maybe been normalized by the time they're 15, 16, 17. It's more difficult. When you talk to kids at 8 and 9 and 10 in the informative years, and these are conversations really that should be taking place at home, but they're not necessarily taking place in
Yeah.
everyone's home. And not everyone has as much exposure. So it's not necessarily, racism or sexism, but there's just maybe less exposure. So it's more ignorance than anything else. But
Yeah.
he's going out to the community and he's trying to make a difference. He and his wife, and it's not just about saying, hey, don't say these words. It's like, let's educate. If you have never met a person who looks different than you, or from a different religion than you, or different race than you, here's an opportunity to get people together and break down some of those barriers and see we're all very alike. We all bleed red, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's important to remember that. And Anthony and his group are doing some great things right now. And it feels like a lot of different communities are embracing getting that type of education. And I think that's something we need to do with the kids who are at a young age, more impressionable. And with different attitudes will become different behavior. And with different behavior, more people will feel included and accepted.
My last question on that it is more to the role of the journalist, and
Mm.
what is the role of sports journalists in the matters of abuse and such? Does there need to be more onus on sports journalists to delve into these stories more than just what happens on the field or ice or whatever?
Alex, I think that's a really fair statement. I think the job of the media, the role is really to be the liaison. It's really to tell stories and to have the truths out there. And it's really incumbent on us to have our ear to the ground and know what's going on. And when, we hear there's certain activities or situations, report on them and report on them thoroughly and know what's happening and why and what are the consequences, etc. And these stories, it's funny. Part of me as a sports broadcaster is like, oh man, there's 10 games on tap tonight. I'd love to just dig in on the games. And then part of me goes, well, we also have a responsibility when there's these other bigger stories, Kyle Beach or Hockey Canada or whatever the stories are. We have to talk about these issues because they're so important. They transcend sport. It goes above and beyond wins and losses and goals and assists. This is like life stories. And that's where, all of us in the media can maybe help make a difference about educating people and telling stories that are really important and maybe helping, bring communities together because of, education and things of that nature. So I think we play an important role. I think we certainly can do better collectively. And that's something I think a lot of us, including our bosses, the senior executives who decide, the content and shows, are starting to really be aware. Like, these aren't stories we can just fluff off. We need to be telling these stories and we need to be digging in and making sure that we're as accountable as we're asking the athletes to be accountable. Right? We have a role in this too.
Well, you put that very beautifully and eloquently, and thank you so much for giving your thoughts. I wanted to transition from the serious and but important matter that we were just talking about to a much more fun NHL talk. Or you're right, you're good, David. You're. I think you'll like this first question. It's if you were commissioner for one day, what rule would you change? NHL commissioner.
Ooh. I think, and this might not be the most popular with some of the players, but I think I would increase overtime to 10 minutes. I think people are bored of the shootout. It's not a satisfying win. Thankfully, and we saw last night, I don't know when this is running, but we saw last night, the Leafs went to overtime against Dallas and they won in overtime.
Yeah,
And that's satisfying. If you lose in overtime, it's satisfying. It's like, okay, it was hockey. I feel
yeah,
people now look at the shootout and say it's a skills competition. And I know 3-on-3 hockey is different than 5-on-5 hockey, but I think we've now just been acclimated to like accept it and enjoy it, embrace it to some level. Um, I would love to see it go to 10 minutes. There are a bunch of other rules that maybe would be even better, but I think just on the surface, a 10-minute overtime, no one would complain about that. There's so much parity in the league, and there's what 20% of the games go to overtime and some to a shootout. So you're talking about one in every 5 games. Just if you had a 10-minute overtime, I think the shootout would be almost gone. In fact, you can go 10-minute shootout and then a tie if they
yeah.
just can't settle it. But I'd be very comfortable that in 10 minutes it will get resolved.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And just as fans, like they're so exciting.
So
They're just so
exciting.
much
It's
fun.
awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And especially now with the NHL, there's so much skill in the league. It's not as though I've never seen one bad 3-on-3 overtime. Um, I wanted to move a bit to what you mentioned earlier that you haven't seen a Canadian team win the Stanley Cup as a broadcaster. What team or and I also know that you mentioned that you thought I think 6 out of the 7 Canadian teams you thought could make the playoffs. Which Canadian team do you think will have the best season this year?
Well, it's funny. I think I could see Edmonton winning the Pacific. I could see them having a great regular season. Having said that, I think the most Stanley Cup ready team is probably just up or down the province in Calgary. I just look at the Flames as a more complete team, top to bottom. I mean, McDavid, Draisaitl, Nurse, they've got some incredible players in Edmonton. But when I look at that 6-man unit, in fact, you can really say a 7-man unit on the blue line for Calgary, and then you have Jacob Markstrom in net, man, like that's a playoff Stanley Cup caliber back end and goalie. And it's just, they're so deep, they're so good. And you could argue, as much as Johnny Gaudreau was fantastic and Matthew Tkachuk's a great player, Huberdeau and Kadri give them a bit more balance. Kadri on that second line, they're not so reliant. Like last year, that top line was so good for Calgary. It's probably the best line in hockey, but they were, once they got into the series with Edmonton and the Lindholm Kachuk Gaudreau line wasn't being as effective, that was it. They didn't get as much complementary scoring. Where I think is Kadri on the second line, not just from an offensive standpoint, but he's a horrible matchup for players because he gets so under their skin. He's so effective.
Hmm.
He's such a good defender in that way that I think they have more elements at their disposal. If I'm Daryl Sutter, I'm probably pretty pleased when I look up and down the lineup. So Calgary, I would say, is probably the best bet to win a cup this year, in my opinion. And Edmonton could end up at the end of the regular season, though, with the most points. And then let's not discount Toronto. I'd love to see Winnipeg have a resurgence. Last year was a complete mess for them. But they're still a really good team with a lot of really good parts. And Connor Hellebuck is a world class goalie. So I look at Winnipeg as definitely in the mix. I was hot for Vancouver to start the year. They've started out quite horribly, but
Yeah.
they have some defensive problems and the injuries have become a problem. And the start is a big problem for them. But, I'd like to think that they still will be fighting for a playoff spot.
I guess I want to ask you a bit after about my Senators, but I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to go back a bit to the Leafs. Like, do you see them as being like a Stanley Cup? Like, do you think they could make the finals? Do you think like they can finally get over that first round hump?
I mean, they certainly could. I mean, I'm not going to say they can't with some of the star power they have as well. do I think this is the best iteration of the Leafs we've seen in the last 6, 7 years? Knowing they've been knocked out in the first round the last 6 years. No, I would say some of the previous teams I would have maybe held the supporting cast around Marner's, Matthews, Tavares, Nylander. I think the jury's still a little bit out on their third and fourth line. We were talking about this last night in the broadcast with Anthony Stewart and Elliot Friedman, and Anthony brought up the point that you want those third and fourth lines to be identity lines, the way New York had that line with Cizikas and Clutterbuck and
Yeah.
Martin, where just everyone's heads on a swivel and they go out there and they just set the tone. They start the period and they set the tone, right? The Leafs don't have those types of players. They just don't. And I wonder if they have an incredibly skilled lineup, but I just wonder if that is an element you need to grind through, 3 and 4 rounds of the playoffs. And watching both Tampa and Colorado last year, they had these guys who could really grind it out. I'm not talking about the McKinnons and the top end guys. I mean, just the guys, the supporting cast around them. And I'm just wondering from the Leaf standpoint, and now that Jake Muzzin's out indefinitely, the blue line is thinned, appreciably from where it might have been. Last year they had Muzzin, they had Lyubushkin, they had a bit more of a physical element to it, and now you have no Muzzin, you've lost Lyubushkin, and I'm just wondering how that's going to play out. So that's a big question mark.
I guess just quickly, do you worry about them in net?
Well, one thing I'll say is Samsonov has been very steady so far. He's only had 3 starts, but he's won them all, and he's been. The big question mark was who's going to be number one, and can Matt Murray stay healthy? And we saw Matt Murray didn't stay healthy at
Yeah.
least early on. And, Samsonov was a great insurance plan. They got him after they got Matt Murray. And, for $1.8 million on an expiring contract, he's playing for a contract. He's playing to sort of reestablish himself at 25 years old as a number one goalie. And maybe that'll happen. So right now, I wouldn't say goaltending is the number one issue with the Leafs. I'd say
Okay.
maybe a little bit of the balance at the back end of their forward group. And also their blue line is just a lot of injuries there. And what does that look like? When you look at the other top blue line, you look at the Stanley Cup teams and the caliber of blue line, whether it's Colorado or Tampa and those types of teams. And, I mentioned Calgary. I don't think the Leafs blue line 1 to 6. They have a lot of talented parts, but I don't think collectively you're like, ooh, that's a blue line that I look at as a Stanley Cup blue line.
And to transition to the Senators, who probably have that problem and probably an even bigger problem on defense, how do you see them going into this year? They've started off decently so far. Do you think they can be a playoff team, or do they really need to add another defenseman?
Well, it's funny. We asked the question. One of our burning questions last night in our broadcast was, which non-playoff team from a year ago do you think will make the playoffs this year? And Anthony Stewart said Ottawa, and I thought that was a pretty good answer. I think Pierre Dorian had as good an offseason as anyone. Adding DeBrincat, adding Giroux. We haven't had a chance to see Cam Talbot because of the injury, but I think I'm a big Cam Talbot fan. And the maturation. You have Sanderson breaking in now. Pardon me. You're going to definitely have some questions on that blue line, but I really like this Ottawa team more than I did a year ago.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to go to the Jets just quickly, if that's okay. Um, uh, no, it's okay. I'm just worried a little bit about as a Jets fan. I don't know if listeners know, but my dad's from Winnipeg and I'm in Ottawa, so I have two affiliations. Do you think like they had such a kind of mediocre pedestrian year last year, and they've been okay so far this year? Do you still believe they could be a really, really good team?
I do. I think they would need everything to fall into place. But I think when you have a goalie like Connor Hellebuck, what did we see 2 years ago, right? Montreal Canadiens, Carey Price, carried them all the way. I know it was the bubble. I know it was a weird time, but um, they made all the way to the final on a decent team, but really they had a superstar goalie and they had a solid defensive core. The Jets' defensive core, it's still a bit of a work in progress, but certainly have Connor Hellebuck. And if they don't have to play him 65 times, so they could play him 58 times and keep him
Mm-hmm.
fresh for a playoff run and for the playoffs, I think you have a great opportunity.
Yeah.
I think you've gone and intentionally or not, you've probably, you know, elevated Blake Wheeler's attention. You took the C off of him. Sort of put him in a position where you can say, screw you guys. Like
Yeah.
I'm still a great player, great leader. And you've then elevated in a way Mark Scheifele, throw the A on him, and you've given him a bit more status. And I just think this could work out really well. And you have a new voice behind the bench. Paul Maurice said they needed a new voice. He resigned last year. And you have Rick Bowness, who I think is, considered by, is held in such high regard in the hockey community. And I think players know where you stand with Rick Bowness. I think that's important. And he challenges players. And he also has he's a very structured approach defensively. So they have a structured approach, Hellebuck, and you have some motivated forwards who are trying to
Mhm.
prove some things. I think that could be a great recipe for the Jets this year.
Well, I hope you're right, and I hope they go far in the playoffs and just make the playoffs. Honestly, I
Mhm.
wanted to move on just the NHL at whole, like as a whole, before I let you go. Who do you see as favorites? I do know that you predicted Calgary versus Rangers in the finals, and you picked the Rangers to win it. Maybe explain a little bit of that choice, and if there's any dark horse teams you really like that people might be sleeping on.
Well, let me preface it by saying I'm an idiot. I'm always bad at these things. So I picked Vancouver to win the Pacific Division last year. So that should give you some sense of where my head is at. Um, I like the Rangers. I had a chance to cover them last year in the East Final versus Tampa. I just think they have this great mix of these, legitimate star players, the Panarins, the Kreiders, the Zibanejad, the Foxes, with this up and coming group, the Kakos, the Heedles, the Lafreniere, the K. Andre Millers. And then you have the world's best goalie in Shesterkin, or he's right there with Vasilevsky, 1B,
Yeah.
whatever. So I just like the makeup of the team. I just think they feel like they've got a bit of mojo here. You got Gerard Gallant, who, as we've seen, is very good when teams sort of are just coming to establish themselves. We saw what he did in Vegas, and he's able to kind of get the us versus the world mentality. And I think
Mhm.
this team has a bit of a chip from last year and getting as far as they did. They think they have some confidence, but they also know they can go further. And man, they're fast. Like,
Yeah.
and it's a speed game now, as you know. Like, they can skate and they can skate hard and they can skate top to bottom in that lineup. And I think that's going to serve them well. So that was my rationale. And, look, watch them miss the playoffs or something now. But at least when I was thinking it through, I was like, what would be kind of a sexy pick, right? It's easy to say Colorado, Tampa again, but I thought, no, I'll go off the board a little bit and take this up and coming rising team, in a division where there's a lot of question marks. Obviously, Carolina is a very good team, Pittsburgh's a very good team, but there are some question marks in that division. And I thought, maybe the surest thing are the New York Rangers.
And is there another dark horse team other than the two that you've mentioned that you really like, or
Yeah, I've cooled on them because they've got off to a horrible start. But if I'm going to pick someone out west, I did really last year. I liked the makeup of the Minnesota team.
okay?
I like the Wild, but it's funny. I was asking some of our analysts. I'm on a new show, Rogers Monday Night Hockey, and I was talking to Anson Carter and Keith Yandel, and they weren't as hot on Mini as I was, and they kind of had some reasons. I was like, okay, when you put it that way, you
Mhm.
know, just maybe shed some light on it. But I don't know. The Wild I looked at as a team that I think Fleury needs to be the Marc Andre Fleury, Vesna winner from 2 years ago. And he's gotten off to a very tough start. But I like, I guess, the makeup of that Minnesota team as far as the balance and
Mhm.
size, and they can
Yeah.
grind you out in skill. So we'll see.
Yeah, no, I'm watching them. They're coming to Ottawa next week, so
Ah,
I'll see them and I'll give you a scouting report.
nice.
I just wanted to end off. You just mentioned before you go that you have a new show, Rogers Monday Night Hockey. Maybe just speak about the new show and the new program and anything else that you have coming up for Sportsnet.
Well, it's really exciting. It's a brand new show. We've only actually had one episode so far, and we're going to have our second one coming up on Monday. Every week we have at least one Canadian team featured. And what's cool about the show is, it's not about the type of analysis you might get elsewhere. Hey, the zone entries are really bad, or, hey, the dump and chase and all these sorts of things. We want opinions. We want opinions. We want debate. We want conversation. And we have the perfect people for that. We have Cassie Campbell Pascal, two-time Olympic gold medal winner, and a lot of strong opinions. We have Anson Carter, who's on TNT, does a great job, 200 plus goals in the NHL. Again, really strong opinions on things, a very creative guy. And what's also cool is we have Keith Yandel, who's like fresh off retirement, all-time NHL Ironman, at least for another week until Phil Kessel passes him. And he sees the game through such a lens that he's right there. He just left the dressing room, and you don't often get guys into your studio who just came off a 16-year career. So they have worlds of credibility and worlds of experience, and it's incumbent on me to sort of just get the conversation started and force them to sort of take some strong opinions, and we're going to have some great debate, and we're gonna have some fun doing it. So that's sort of the idea of the show. Let's break
Mhm.
down the games, but we'll do it in a fun way, conversation driven, and we hope people enjoy it and welcome us into their homes. And we have some great matchups this Monday. We have Edmonton Pittsburgh. So you have Crosby versus
Wow.
McDavid. What's going to be better than that? So we're really excited this year.
Well, thank you so much, David, for taking the time out of your busy day to come on. And I had a great time, and thank you so much.
My pleasure, Alex, and good meeting you. And obviously, our fathers worked together way in the past,
Yeah.
which is a pretty cool, lineage. And now here we are working together
Yeah.
on this podcast. So thanks so much, and good luck with everything.
Thank you very much. And listeners of Behind the Play, we'll have another episode coming out shortly. So stay tuned.